Hi, I'm Colin with Western Interlock, and we're going to be talking about two seminars today. The first one is how to install concrete interlocking paving stones, and the second one is how to install a fire pit. Before I get started on the how-tos, I would like to talk for a little bit about our DIY with WI Facebook page. So this page is really just to help homeowners, contractors, everyone using our product or anybody else's product with just questions about technical things with their project, pricing, pictures of your projects when you're done with them that you did yourselves. It's really just a help outlook there for you. So back to the paving stones. I always like to talk about the benefits of paving stones versus wet poured concrete before I get into the steps and instructions. So basically right off the bat, our concrete paving stones, the standard is to have at least 8,000 PSI of pressure. Wet poured concrete typically is 4,000 PSI. So with twice the density right off the bat, you are going to have a longer lasting product, a longer lasting pavement, which is pretty important in terms of investment and longevity. Also, concrete paving stones are supposed to be installed with a compacted gravel base, and they're all flexible. And the fact that when vehicles move over them, basically your base material and your paving stones can move and still be one solid unit, whereas concrete, which will eventually crack and separate into sections, will be less efficient in terms of a pavement. So concrete paving stones are harder and will last longer and are more durable, and can withstand elements better. And also just the installation process is better for longevity and traffic applications. Okay, so on to the how-to and the steps and instructions. So on our website, you should have access to our 10 steps and instructions on how to install paving stones. They're just a short little 2-page deal. Pretty simple on the steps. We do have blogs on our website as well that have in-depth installation things for both the fire pit and paving stones. So if anything I say isn't remembered, you could always refer to our blogs, or you could ask a question over the Facebook page about a specific thing with your project. But basically, I'm going to be going through these 10 steps like I typically would with a live seminar, and hopefully we can get the gist across. So step 1 is design. Typically, we always like to recommend writing that down on some graph paper. That way you can use each square as a square foot. So if that's what you want to go with, you have a reference for how much material to order in terms of the paving stones and the base material, and you can actually use that also to get a basic idea of how much dirt you would be excavating out of your project as well. So once you have it drawn on a piece of paper, graph paper, and you're pretty satisfied with that, then you can move on to step 2, which is the layout. So what you would do is you go outside your house, wherever your project is, whether it's a walkway or patio, and you're going to want to take some marking paint and mark out the area where you want the paving stones to be. So I'm going to be drawing things on the whiteboard and also doing some stuff on a gravel frame at the same time, kind of back and forth. But I always like to draw as a secondary reference to kind of help people out. So if you were to go outside in your backyard, and I always like to use like a simple 10 by 20 patio as a reference. It's easy math. It's square, pretty basic to install with most types of material. So if you went outside your house, and you took your marking paint, we always recommend white marking paint. In a lot of states, can even be illegal to use any color of marking paint when marking out an area to excavate, because at one point, before you excavate, we always recommend that you get a locate. This just helps. A lot of times people don't have anything going on in their backyard, but it just helps make sure that if you do run anything, then you're covered. You don't want to accidentally run into anything that could be costly. And if you do run into anything without having a locate done, it is your fault and you will have to pay for that. So you'd go outside and you'd mark out your patio or walkway. And this kind of gives you a good reference for how big it's actually going to be. So this is the point where you'd want to make it bigger or smaller, or maybe add some curves here or there, plan out some seating walls and stuff like that. But basically, once you're satisfied with that marked out area, I always go back and you basically do a dotted line, or you could do another solid line. And this is going to be 6 inches outside the edge, because this solid line we made references where our paving stones are going to be, but this dotted line is so that we make sure we excavate 6 inches past the edge of our paving stones, and we have base material out there so that you have a strong area of gravel for your edge restraint. So that's step 1, step 2. Now we're on step 3, which is get it square. So this is most helpful to you when you're laying the paving stones, because most times you're laying a square pattern. But we always like to recommend setting up some stakes and string lines for square before you excavate. That way you make sure you excavate square, because if you just kind of mark it on the fly, you could potentially have some off square lines, and you could be either over excavating in some areas or under excavating. So the easiest way for me to get something square is you run a couple of stakes, and a foundation is pretty straight, but no matter what any concrete guy says, there's not a perfectly straight foundation in the world. So you take 2 stakes, you stretch a string across, and the goal here is to make sure that you make your string line as close as you can to that foundation without touching it anywhere. If you can get as close as you can without touching it, that makes sure that you are perfectly straight with your house. So that's your straight reference line, but you also need a square reference line away from your house to make sure for your dig out and for when you're laying paving stones. So what you would do is you'd add a couple more stakes and put them close to the edge of your paving stones. You'd stretch an additional string line, and within this string line you do what's called the 3-4-5 triangle, or the Pythagorean theorem. And what that is if you measure 3 feet out here and 4 feet out here, and you mark on your string line where 3 feet and 4 feet is, and then when you stretch your tape measure from point to point, and it's exactly 5 feet, that's just a good quick reference for making sure that you're perfectly square. Once you have those 2 lines set up, you can set up an additional one over here if you wanted to for your other edge. This just makes sure that you excavate square, and then later on when you lay your paving stones, you could use that string line again as a square reference line for laying. So that's step 3, get it square. And then we have step 4, which is set the grade. So a common misconception with paving stones is that you can just make them perfectly level and the water is made to drain through them. While there is a type of paving stone system called permeable paving stones where that is the case, the most common form of paving stones, which are called sand-set paving stones, are specifically designed for water to drain off of them. So what you have to do is you have to have grade and slope away from your house especially, or any building or structure that water could create damage to. So what you do, and I'm going to kind of demonstrate this on my gravel table here with some square nails and string lines. So pretend this was your stake from the top of your area to the bottom, and you took a string line, and this could be your string line that you set for square, and you could just use it again for your grade. You loop it on one end and you tie it off on the other. And the main goal here is to set your grade, or where the top of your paving stones are going to be. And this is your reference for when you excavate. So once you set the top end of your string line, where the top of your paving stones are going to be the top of your house, obviously you have to have slope away from your house. So first thing you have to do is get it level. Use a string line level. A little high in the back here for a quick measure and reference. We're just going to make this work. So right now I have a level string line. I'm just going to tighten this up, make sure it doesn't pull out. Okay. Whew. Okay. Got a level string line maybe sometime today. Perfect. Okay, so I have a level string line going away from my house, and what I have to do is set some slope. So the standard specification for slope or drainage on concrete interlocking paving stones is about 1/8 of an inch per linear foot. So if I have a 10 by 20 patio for reference, I'm going to need to drop my string 1.25 inches away from my house. So what you would do is you'd go to this stake. This is where wooden stakes would be beneficial. So go down here, you find your 1.5 inches, take a pencil or a marker, mark your stake, and you can go ahead and drop your string line. Okay, so now this first string line has grade away from my house, and what you can do, because obviously it can be hard to reference the grade of your entire project through just one string line, what I always do is I set multiple string lines, and I kind of try to do 4 or 5 feet in between them. So for a 10 by 20, I'd have at least 4 string lines going down my patio. String line here, and there's a string line here. And you can set all these to grade. So this line across the back of your house is going to be level all the way across, because typically you're matching up with some sort of threshold like a door or an existing concrete patio, and you want your paving stones to be flat and level with that. So this crossway is level, but you want the drainage away from your house. There is some situations where you might need to drain your patio a different way, but as long as you use that rule of thumb of fall per linear foot to a direction where it's okay to do that to, then you can do that. It doesn't always have to be straight away. It can be corner to corner, but as long as you have some grade away from your house or structures, you'll be okay. So we've set up 4 string lines going down our patio. We got 1 string line right now across. Like I said, as long as you get a locate, you can go ahead and start working on your excavation, which is step 5. So just for reference, the excavation of this process is the process where you're going to remove the most amount of material. Your gravel will be around half as much. Your paving stones can be moved pretty fast, but the dirt is the largest quantity of material you will move from this project. So the easiest way to do that for you, the better and the faster this is going to be. So if you need to borrow a truck from a friend, rent a truck or dump trailer or dump truck, whatever you need to do to make this cost effective and fast for you is going to be the easiest. And I know that when you add up all these rentals of vehicles and equipment, it might seem like it could be cheaper just to hire somebody to do this. A lot of the reason we talk about this is because at the end of the day, no matter how much equipment you could rent or how much more money you will spend on materials versus a contractor would, this will always be cheaper to do it yourself. It's just if you want to do the work or not. So that being said, back to the excavation, this is the largest amount of material we'll move. So the easiest way to do that, the better and the faster. So basically, when it comes to excavation with me, I like to use equipment if I can, or if you have access. If you can't, a pickaxe is going to be your best friend through this process. So take wheelbarrows and a pickaxe and shovels, and you just kind of have to pick it down. And you're going to be using these string lines as a reference the entire time. If you're wondering about the amount you would dig underneath that string line, it can vary a little bit, but the main specification is to have at least 4 inches of compacted gravel. Here in Oregon, we specify 3/4 minus as the gravel you'd want to use. It can change by state. You'd have at least 1 inch of bedding sand material. We always recommend concrete sand, washed concrete sand. And most paving stones that we sell, or that a lot of people sell, are 60 millimeter or about 2 3/8. So overall, that's going to equal a depth of about 7 3/8. But a lot of these types of paving stones you would compact, so you would lose that 3/8 inch and it would make it about 7. So we always recommend that you dig about 7 inches down from the top of your string lines, which is where your paving stones are going to be, to have the proper depth of the base material and the bedding material. So underneath all these string lines, we're going to dig 7 inches down, and that may seem hard to achieve. But like I said, the pickaxe, you scrape away a few inches at a time. It can be done pretty fast, and then you move it to wherever you need to move it to. If you have any planter beds you are thinking about building in the future, that's a great place to store some dirt. That way you don't have to pay to haul it off. But however you need to achieve that 7 inches below all your string lines, you just got to do it. So step 6 now is set the base. So again, like I said, we always recommend 3/4 minus. But before you put your base material in, I just want to talk for a few minutes about a material called geotextile. This is a small piece of geotextile I use for the seminars to easy cleanup for my sand. But basically what this is a high tensile strength woven material And it kind of does two things. The main thing it does is it separates your dirt from your gravel. So if you have some wet type of soil, if the soil migrates into your gravel, it can promote settling because it's moist and it can expand and contrast with freeze-thaw cycles. So that can prevent that. And one thing it also can do is it can kind of bridge any small areas of settling. If you have just little ruts here and there, because of its tensile strength, it can bridge that and keep it from settling. Also, there's one thing I wanted to touch on that I kind of forgot about before with the excavation process is when you're excavating, if you overdig anywhere, just make sure that you never fill in any areas with dirt. It's a common thing that happens, and most times nothing happens, but you always want to make sure that if you overdig that you backfill with gravel, compacted gravel. The dirt, when you put it back in, even if you compact it, it's never as hard or as dense as it once was. It's considered disturbed soil at that point. So just make sure throughout this process, before you bring all the gravel in, make sure that all string lines are down 7 inches and that nothing is overdug. Okay, so now back to the gravel. So what you would do is you would lay this geotextile on top of your dirt and you kind of spread it out. And one good thing to do too for preventative measure is kind of wrap it up the sides of your excavation if you can. That just adds a little bit more tensile strength. Once you have that geo in place, then you can start bringing in your gravel. So the easiest thing to do is to bring in your gravel in sections and just kind of spread it out because that kind of helps de-wrinkle the geo. Spread it out, and then we're going to talk a little bit about compaction. So another place where people typically go wrong on a paving stone project is compaction. They don't have enough of it. So there is some standards and specifications on what type of compaction you need, but for most average homeowners, depending on where they live, a lot of rental yards typically only have small plate compactors, and those plate compactors will work fine. You just want to make sure that if you use that smaller plate compactor that you do it in 2-inch lifts in order to achieve the proper compaction. So what you would do is you'd lay your geo out, you'd bring in your gravel, you'd want to keep these string lines because you can also use these as a reference for your gravel in terms of how much to bring in. You want to bring in 2 inches at a time. So if you dug out 7, you'd bring it up to 5, then you'd compact it, then you'd bring an additional 2 inches to about 3, then you'd compact it again. And just for reference, the more flat and perfect you make your gravel, the more flat and perfect your paving stones are going to look. When they settle over time, the first thing they're going to do is settle wherever there are imperfections in your base material. So the more flat and perfectly consistent you make your gravel, the more flat and perfectly consistent your paving stones will be. So you bring in 4 inches of base, you've compacted in 2-inch lifts. That way you make sure you have proper compaction. One thing I always do is if I'm checking my string lines and everything is perfect, and I think the gravel is really, really close, one last thing I do for preventative measure is I'll pull most of my string lines. I always like to keep the first 2 I set up for square so I can use them to lay. So you pull up your string lines. Pull them up and get them out of your way. Everything else as well. And then you want to use a 2x4 or some sort of flat board, just the flattest board you can find. I know that might be hard to achieve with some 2x4s, but as flat as you can make it, what you would do is you would basically rake over all your gravel one more time, and that just helps kind of any spaces in between your string lines where you might not have had as good of a reference for where you need to be exactly. It can help rake down any high spots and bring any gravel, excess gravel, into low spots. So what that does is it basically gives you one last measure to make everything perfectly flat. So you just move your board across there, make it flat, then give it one more good compaction, and then it's pretty much ready for sand. All right, which moves us on to step 7, which is screed the sand bed. So like I said earlier, the type of sand we recommend is washed concrete sand. Depending on where you live, that could be a little bit different. And also, like I had said before, you typically put the geo on top of your dirt. I put it on top of my gravel just for seminars because I like easy cleanup. Just kind of helps with that. So your gravel is compacted. Everything looks great. You bring in your sand. So what I'm laying down here is 1 inch outside diameter metal square tubing. It doesn't have to be square. It can be round, but as long as it's a uniform 1 inch and outside diameter, that's the main thing. That is the specification for how tall to make sand, bedding sand, for most paving stones, and that's what we always like to express. So anything 1 inch and outside diameter, metal is preferred just because it's heavier. If you try to use 1 inch PVC, it can kind of move on you while you're pulling it. So you set your rails. This also gives you one more time to kind of check for level crossways, and it also can help you be consistent across your patio, because as you're screeding sections at a time, you'll screed here and then move over and screed here. And a good thing to do would be to check crossways level as you're screeding to make sure it's all perfectly consistent across. And also, just for reference, we never recommend that you screed anything more than what you can cover in that day. That doesn't matter if it's raining outside or if it's sunny outside. Either one of those two variables can affect your sand. So screed an area, get it covered, then move on to screeding again, just to make sure, because if your sand dries out in the sun, it can be too loose and not proper for laying paving stones, or if it's too wet, it could be pumping water in there, which would also be improper. So you want your sand to be just a tad moist, and only screed what you can lay in a day. So I'm going to take a shovel, move some sand in here. Like I said, this is washed concrete sand. And it's just a tad moist. You don't want it to where water's coming out of it, but you don't also want it to where it's very dry either. So if you just kind of, typically you could just dump wheelbarrow loads, which is a lot easier than what I get to do. But this is a small area. Just kind of spread it out across your rails. So you'd also use the flattest 2x4 you can find for this as well. And what you would do is, typically I'd be on my knees, but I want everybody to be able to see what I'm doing here. Kind of just feather it across. And I'm going to push instead of pull, just for reference, so everybody can see. Kind of push it across, and if you need to move your rails a little bit here and there, you can. Just drag them on. Just double check them level as you do. If you need any more sand here and there, have someone bring it to you or add more. Kind of just finish off this last area. Perfect. Feather it across there. Screed it. We're just going to finish it off onto the floor. All right. So after you've screeded an area, obviously you would want to pull these metal screed rails. Just yank them out, and then you're left with these channels. These channels are pretty easy to fill. Just going to fill them with a trowel. If you have a nice flat broom, you could also fill them with that. What you do is just take a trowel, just fill in all these voids. Just kind of feather it in there. Make it as flat and uniform as possible. Need to add more here and there. Do that. Okay. We've filled both of our screed rail channels here. Everything looks nice and flat. So you're pretty much ready to lay. So like I had mentioned earlier, you kind of want to try and make sure you leave these first two string lines set up for square. Or if you've hit them or something on the way, you can just set them up again and just recheck square with your foundation. And you're pretty much ready to start laying. So I like to just use a little drywall square to help me lay, just for sake of time. But basically, you don't want to walk on this sand. That's also another good reason to not lay more than what you can lay in a day, so that nobody accidentally walks on it or a dog or something. But as soon as you have an area large enough to stand on, you can stand on it. So basically what you do is, depending on the pattern, there's a lot of tricky patterns out there. The pattern I'm going to be doing today is called the mustard cave pattern, the eye pattern. It's pretty common. I'm using Camino stone, Jamestown, Rex and squares just for reference. But depending on the pattern and stone, no matter which one, typically there's at least two sides of that area you can lay without cuts. So this long continuous line here up against my foundation, which is the longest part of the area, I'm pretty confident that I won't have any cuts there. And I won't have any cuts along this edge too, depending on how you start the pattern. If you reference our brochure, there's a lot of starts to patterns to show you how to lay areas of stone without any cuts, which is good and could be time and cost effective. So I'll start my pattern here. Again, these are Camino stone, Jamestown, Rex and squares, and the mustard K or I pattern. When laying stones, it's pretty straightforward. We always like to use what we call the click and drop method, where basically what you do is when you pick up your stone, you kind of butt it up against the stone and drop it like that, versus setting it down in the sand and pulling it towards you. It can kind of make larger joints and make ununiform lines and kind of fight you for square the whole time. So it's better just to use the click and drop method to really be efficient. Just lay in here. Like I said, once the area is big enough to stand on, you can stand on it. It's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. And for me, it typically helps me to make sure I try and lay in a 45-degree angle. So just like your 3-4-5 triangle, you'd start in your corner and then you'd work out like this. That's just kind of the most natural way to help maintain a square line. Continue laying the rest of these here. And so I've managed to lay all 4 sides without any cuts. This isn't always achievable. It kind of depends on how many rows you go down and where your modules are. But it is definitely achievable so long as you keep square and straight lines and you have a rectangular or square area. You can achieve 4 sides of a patio or walkway with no cuts. But just to talk for reference for a little bit, if you do have any cuts, what you would probably have to do is go to your local rental yard. They typically have a 10-inch tile saw or maybe even a paver saw, or you can use a demo saw. Any of those things, whatever has a diamond blade, just make sure you put some water on it, because the silica dust that are created when cutting paving stones can be pretty harmful. But if you have any curves or anything like that, you're guaranteed some cuts. They're not impossible, but they do take time. So however you need to cut any edges or corners, you would want to do that. And then we can talk about step 9, which is edge restraint. So there's a couple different types of edge restraint. The edge restraint we most commonly talk about is snap edge. So this is a recycled plastic. You would hammer 10-inch spikes in around this. We talk about it a lot and recommend it because it's easy to install. It can do square edges, obviously, and also can do inside and outside curves. So there's basically no limit to what type of project these can do. Once you've had your patio laid and everything that you needed to cut, you've cut in, what you would do is you'd have to scrape away your excess sand. So we're going to take our trowel here and scrape away all the sand. Typically, if you're laying up against a concrete foundation, you don't have to worry about restraining this back end. Even if there's a little bit of gappage here and there because of the inconsistency of your concrete foundation, that void can just be filled with sand. So you come around to your edges and you scrape away your sand. And just also, if it's been a day or so, depending on how much time you have to do your project, if it's been a day and your sand's kind of dried a little bit, it's always good to take a garden hose and go back and sort of wet the entire edge. That way the sand underneath is moist, because when you pull it away with your trowel, as I'll demonstrate here in front, you'll pull it away, and if it was dry, it would just slough off, and then you'd have a harder time getting your snap edge in, and it would also make all sorts of funny gaps and stuff like that. So you just pull straight away, give yourself enough room for your snap edge. So once you've scraped all your sand away, it's nice and clean, you can start putting in your snap edge and spikes. So what we're gonna do, we got some pre-cut pieces here. Yep, that's the one there. And like I said, you typically hammer 10-inch spikes in there. They look like this. These are actually just standard steel. They will rust, and they actually want them to rust because they will adhere themselves to the snap edge, and also will grow in mass in the gravel, and therefore be a little bit stronger than just a 3/8-inch spike. For the sake of the demonstration and my limited depth of frame here, I have some special short spikes that I use. So the rule of thumb for spikes is 1 in every 3rd hole, which equals to about every linear foot for pedestrian traffic. If you're doing a driveway, they recommend every other hole, which is about every 8 inches. So just a few more spikes there for if you're doing vehicular traffic. So you just come through here, hammer in some spikes. It's also a good little test for your compaction. If you're just hammering these spikes in here completely effortlessly, probably don't have good compaction, but if it takes a lot of work, you've got good base that will last you a long time. So there's one piece. Got this piece. It's a little too long. That's okay. We can cut it. Okay, cut that piece. Start nailing it in here. There's that one. Oops. And this one. Just one more end here. Kind of gauge it for reference. Oh boy. All right. Pop this last piece down, grab a few more stakes. Some of these are a little long here. And that's our last one. Okay, so now you've got your edge restraint in. And depending on the type of product you have, and at Western Lock we do a pretty good job of in our brochures, we basically have little icons that show you limits to those specific types of paving stones. So if you have some paving stones that are more considered slabs, just larger in surface area or thinner, typically we don't recommend to compact those, but if you just pay attention to the brochure, you'll know that. But most paving stones are compacted, and that's kind of essential in the first phase of interlock. So the term interlock that's commonly used in the concrete paver world is actually not just because they have patterns and such. It's more so that when you sweep sand into the joints, it creates pressure around the stones, and you have a strong bond there that inhibits you from trying to pivot stones out of place. So for vehicular traffic, it's pretty good. But the first phase of interlock is where you would take a plate compactor, and you can use a smaller plate compactor for this, the same one you probably use for your gravel at the same rental yard. So what you do is you'd run over it once. I usually just go once each direction. And then you can bring in your sweeping sand, sweep your sand in the joints, and this time it's easier just to kind of overfill the joints. Then you compact it this last time both ways, and then you want to kind of sweep your edges clean. A good rule of thumb is to keep your sand about an 1/8 inch below the top of the paving stone. That's also kind of a common misconception. You want the sand to be pretty low. If you have it higher up in the joints, especially for a driveway, your car tires could be kicking up sand repeatedly over time. So aesthetically, it's not really the best option. You want to kind of keep that sand low to keep it from coming out of your joints. Once you've swept your sand in, you've compacted the stones at least twice. That's pretty much a done deal. But what I always like to talk about is a little bit about maintenance. So a lot of people switch to paving stones versus their existing yard to have lower maintenance. While they are a lot less maintenance than lawn, there still is a little bit of maintenance a few times a year that I would just highly recommend in order to stay on top of your overall paver maintenance. So there's a couple things you can do instead of just joint sand. So to help with the moss and weeds. So you could do polymeric sand, which is a sand that you sweep in the joints just like regular sand, dry, and then you activate it with water. And what that does is it hardens because of the polymers in it, and that inhibits plants from being able to grow up through your joints, and it can reduce your moss by quite a bit. So there's that method, or there's a method where you use a sealer that's joint stabilizing. So this is a spray-on or roll-on sealer, and basically what this does is it protects the finish of the stones while also could be giving it a wetter look. It also hardens up the sand in the joints just like the polymeric sand and reduce those weeds and moss. No matter which method you use, there's some situations where moss is sort of unavoidable. If you're in like a damp area with a lot of shade, you'll still get moss, maybe not as much on the surface, but if you do have a sealer, it can be easier to clean off. But if you stay on top of your moss, clean it once or twice a year, it can be very manageable and will still look great. Overall, with the reduced maintenance, I understand it is a pretty big investment to install paving stones. Even if you do it yourself, it may seem like the material is costly, but at the end of the day, you're going to have a very long-lasting project with the most suitable form of pavement that you can buy. Hi, I'm Colin with Western Interlock. We're back now for our second seminar, which is how to install a fire pit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be following with these 6-step instructions that we also have access to on our westerninterlock.com, our website. So if you want to look back at these later on after this, just to double check your references and have some writing, you could do that. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing some stuff on the board, kind of draw how to mark your circle, and then kind of a basic cutout of the excavation and base process for a fire pit. It's not super extensive. And then we'll come down to the floor and I'll show you how to set your first course. We're just on top of concrete, we're not on top of gravel, but I'll talk pretty in depth about how that would typically go, and then show you the proper way to glue the blocks for the fire pit and so on and so forth. So set these down really quick. So step one, just like with paving stones, is design. This is a little bit more basic in the fact that you just kind of have to pick a size of a fire pit that you want. We offer a few different sizes. You can basically go as round as you want, or you can order different blocks for square, rectangular fire pits. Your options are pretty much unlimited, but we do sell a couple of kits. We sell a 40-inch kit and a 50-inch kit. The one I'll be using and talking about today is the 50-inch kit. So the first step I would do is pound a stake in the ground close to the center of where you would want that fire pit. So you put your stake in the ground outside, and you take a marking paint. You take a tape measure and you measure 25 inches if you're doing a 50 like we are, 25 inches away from that stake. And you basically just go in a circle. So here's my center. And then here's just my quick reference circle here using a string line. Perfect, okay. Like I said, you typically have a stake in the middle to reference for. Once you have it painted, you can move on to step 2, which is excavate and base. So the basic excavation process for a fire pit is pretty much half of what paving stones are. You have your existing grass here, and then you're basically going to cut it away, we say about 3 or 4 inches. That's going to give you enough room for 3 or 4 inches of gravel. So this stuff down here is gravel. This is all dirt and grass, and this gives you a good, just about an inch of embedment. It's good for your blocks. And here's your blocks. And we set each one of those levels. So for your gravel, we always recommend 3/4 minus, just like with paving stones. This area is pretty much too small to really justify renting a plate compactor. So it's fine just using a hand tamper, maybe do 2-inch lifts just to make sure you get some good compaction. The better your compaction is, the longer your fire pit is going to stay flat. So that's basically the gist of using the whiteboard in terms of marking a circle for your fire pit to excavate. And then here's a basic cutout of the excavation. Like I said, you only need 3 or 4 inches of gravel, therefore you really only need 3 or 4 inches of excavation. So now we're gonna come back and we're gonna go to the floor and we're gonna show you how to set that first course and the gluing and the stacking of the additional courses. So we're down here on the floor. Like I said, we're just on a cement floor, but we're just gonna imagine that I've excavated some soil away and I've brought in some gravel and I've hand tamped it. Once you're at that point, the easiest thing for me, especially because our fire pit kits are round, and depending on how you start them, you might not end once you get around the circle at a good spot aligned with your first block. So the easiest way for me to make sure I'm perfectly circular for my base course is I just go ahead and I lay the entire base course on top of the compacted gravel before I actually start setting any block. So our Chateau fire pit kit, which is what I'm using today, contains 60 pieces of what are called Chateau bevel. They're a 4-inch block. It gives you 3 rings high, which is about 1 foot tall. There's a few different cap options, but very easy. Only weighs about 900 pounds, so a lot of half-ton, smaller pickups can haul this in one trip. So like I said, on top of your compacted gravel, you'll start laying your blocks. Just get them close. That way, if you need to adjust them to make them more perfect, you can. So for this specific fire pit kit, there's only 20 pieces per row. Depending on different fire pit kits, you might have more or less. Finally, I think we're about perfect. Yep. Our last block, need to kick some around to align them a little better. To do that, so our first ring is just on top of the loose gravel. And this is kind of the most challenging and time-consuming part of the whole process. With any retaining wall or decorative wall or fire pit that you do, you have to set a base course in gravel. And this is just basically time-consuming and can be kind of frustrating. But the more time you spend making sure your whole base course is perfectly level and flat, the less time you'll have to spend later on adjusting things to make them look flat or level. So take your time, start with each block. What I always do is I take a level and a hammer. Basically, you just have to go and you just start at one block. You start hitting it, and once it's to level, then you can check the other way, level this way. You basically move from block to block to block in a continuous motion, all flat, to make the entire base course perfectly level. And like I said, the more time and effort you put into this, the more level and flat your wall will be, and you'll have a better structural longevity over time. So just go through, set each block level. Once your base course is set, then you can move on to your second course. There's a variety of different types of glue you can use. Personally, I just like the Sure-Bond 20. It's a flexible adhesive. It's pretty cost effective. Basically, the main thing with gluing blocks especially nice decorative ones where you see both sides of them. So you don't want to put too much glue because it can show when you put your next course of blocks on. So there's a couple of different things you can do to prevent that. So for a fire pit, because it's round, the easiest thing for me is to do kind of corner globs of glue. So if you just go to each corner and you do about a penny-sized dot, you want your next one a penny-sized dot. You just don't really want to have any long, continuous beads of glue because you could potentially see them from the outside or the inside. You definitely don't want to put beads or dots really close to the edge because they could kind of come out of the sides when weight is put on them. So kind of tuck them in the corners, do small ones. I'm not going to glue all of them just because for the sake of the video I want to show you a couple. I can probably show you a couple in the next course, but put some glue down on your next course. It's good because the glue takes a little bit to set up, so you can kind of adjust things as you go to make sure they're perfect straight up and down for the existing course. Okay, so I've done about half of my second ring. For the sake of time, I probably won't complete the whole thing. So I basically completed my second ring. Then using the same method of gluing as I did before, you would apply glue to the next course. And if you have any questions about that gluing, there is a detailed blog and video for how to build a fire pit on our website. It's accessible through our social medias as well, just westerninterlock.com. There's a series of blogs and videos for how-to things and tips and tricks. So if there's anything that you forgot from any one of these seminars, you can go there. Also, our instructions, both the 10 steps for paving stones and the 6 steps for fire pits, are both on there. But we'll go ahead and put our third course on. The kit comes with 60, so that's 3 courses. It's about a foot tall. So if you were to come to Western Interlock or one of our authorized dealers and buy a 50-inch Chateau fire pit kit, this is basically the look and overall height that we're offering in a variety of different colors. Any color that we make in the Chateau Wall in our brochure is a color that we make in this fire pit. So you've done your base course with your first ring, you've glued up your second ring, then you would have glued up your third ring, and that's basically all that the Western Interlock Chateau fire pit kit entails. We do sell different types of caps for it if you want. You basically just glue this course and then apply your caps. So that's the basic instructions on how to install a fire pit. You can use the same form of instructions for other fire pit kits, not just Western Interlocks. But again, if you have any questions at all, you can contact us at our DIY with WI Facebook page or through emails and websites and stuff like that. Thanks.